Good evening. Dear colleagues and friends of the American School and its archives, I'm Natalia Vogiakov-Brogan, Director of the School's Archives, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the annual Archives Lecture. Since 2007, the Archives have organized an annual event which aims to promote the use of archival resources in scholarly research. To do this, we invite speakers whose work stems from archival research, or we organize conferences and recently exhibitions with themes that require research and promote the school's archival collections. 2022 was a good year for the archives because we were able to organize not one but three important events, including tonight's talk. On February 3rd, no, is it? Sorry. Yes. On February 3rd, we celebrated the bicentennial of Heinrich Schliemann's birth with the launch of an online exhibition curated by Dr. Eleftheria D'Alessio, myself, and digitally produced by Konstantinos Georginis, entitled The Staff of Legend, Heinrich Schliemann's Life and Work, showcasing material from the rich Schliemann archive, which is housed at the American School. The main goal of the exhibition, which was the first online exhibition of the American School designed as such from the beginning, was to educate and reach out to the lay audience with the help of experts. As you can see on the slide, 10 months after its creation, the exhibition still features a high score of daily visits, a fact that highlights the lasting value of such online microsites. To commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Asia Minor catastrophe, the archives organized a large exhibition devoted to Greek literature written during the interwar period about both the drama of 1922 and the refugee dome that followed. The show also grapples with the impact of the Greco-Turkish War on contemporary Turkish literature. Titled The Epic of Anatolia in the Greek Imagination, the Asia Minor Catastrophe in Literature Between the Wars, the exhibition opened on October 20th and is available until February 20th. On Thursdays, it is open until 10 p.m. So tonight, at the end of Christina Luke's talk, whoever of this audience has not seen the exhibition, you know where it is. Okay, tonight's speaker, Dr. Christina Luke, has studied anthropology at Scripps College and Cornell University, where she received her PhD in 2002. Since 2015, she has taught at Koç University in Istanbul in the Department of Archaeology and History of Art, where she is an associate professor. She also maintains her connection with Boston University, teaching in the archaeology program. Christina is also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Field Archaeology. In reading her curriculum vitae, I was amazed by the breadth of her research and publications, from landscape archaeology and environmental studies to cultural diplomacy and critical heritage. As a field archaeologist, she is co-director of the Gigaya projects, okay, I pronounced it correctly, a group of activities concerned with research and preservation in areas of cultural and natural history, focusing on the Lake Marmara Basin, Homer's Gigean Lake, Gigea Limni. Her co-authored publications cover a wide chronological spectrum, from libation practices in the 2nd millennium BCE to strategies of managing lakes and wetlands in the Ottoman period, or preserving mud brick architecture in diachronic contexts. Tonight, Christina Luke will be wearing her cultural diplomacy hat. In 2019, she published an important book about the history and archaeology of Izmir and its countryside during the last 2 centuries, titled A Pearl Imperial, Heritage and Diplomacy in Turkey. Her historical analysis uses multiple perspectives to examine the impact of political agendas and social engineering at archaeological sites. Tonight's talk, Americans and Antiquity in Anatolia at the End of Empire, explores the role, I think we should go, explores the role of archaeologists from Princeton University in the Ottoman Empire during the first two decades of the 20th century. From Constantinople to Jerusalem, Christina shows how Princeton became entangled in and benefited from the fracturing of not only the Ottoman, but also the British and German imperial regimes in its pursuit of a favorable future for America in the region. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Christina Luke to the podium.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Yes, okay. Thank you very much for that introduction. It's wonderful to be here. I was last in Athens many, many years ago before the metro, and I've had a nice time rummaging around the city for the last couple of days. Okay, so as you just heard, tonight my work will focus a bit on, or more than that, what I published in Pearl and Peril, as well as my ongoing work that relates to the period roughly between 1890 and 1936, yet tonight I will stop it at 1922. And it revolves broadly around the region from Constantinople to Jerusalem. And now I need to learn. Do I press, let's see here. Yeah, okay, good. With special attention on the site in the hinterlands of Sardis, in what is today a place about an hour east of Izmir. On the 9th of September in 1922, fires started in Smyrna. The atrocities that ensued mark a low point in the collective human experience. And my interest here tonight is not to examine who started the fires nor the path that the flames took, but rather tonight I will explore the historiography of how a close network of American archaeologists working in the hinterland of Smyrna at Sardis became embroiled in this conflict. From the establishment of the Archaeological Institute of America in 1897, and then its international footprints at the American School of Classical Studies at Athens in 1881, where we are now, the American Academy in Rome in 1894, and the American Schools of Oriental Research in 1900, American archaeologists entered this territory under imperial models. In making their claims to antiquity, both movable and immovable, they became assets in alliance building for territorial expansion, conceptually as well as physically. In less than a decade after World War I, this vexed imperial realm would be transformed into nationalized spaces, and in this process, conceptual thinking of internationalization would emerge. Antiquity offered a powerful paradigm to present the ideal of collaborative governance, yet simultaneously allies leveraged arcs of power embedded in emerging corporate interests tied to re-territorialization. I explore this situation through the archive turn from collections at American universities, notably the William Hepburn Buckler papers at Yale and the Howard Crosby Butler papers at Princeton. And here I must thank archivist Julia Gerhardt for her ongoing guidance, and thank you also for your patience with me. And yes, their names are frustratingly too similar. So I'll do my best tonight to indicate who's who as I go through them. Okay, So let's start with Butler. He studied as an undergraduate at Princeton before completing his graduate work at Columbia School of Architecture. He spent considerable time in the greater Mediterranean sphere, including in Rome and Athens and Jerusalem at the schools that had just opened, as well as in Constantinople. He would later return to Princeton as faculty, and over the 2 decades pursued the establishment of a proper school of architecture there. He would also lead expeditions in Syria and at Sardis, which I'll be talking about tonight. Next, there is Buckler, an American who was born in France, educated in England, and then established his law practice in Baltimore. Law didn't suit him so well, and so he pivoted towards diplomacy, serving in Spain before funding. He also had access to personal wealth and participating at Sardis. During World War I, he served at the US Embassy in London, and then he served with the American delegation at the Paris Peace Conference. And there he became more and more involved with once the higher-ranking Henry White, who was also his half-brother, became ill with the Spanish flu, and that gave Buckler a front seat at the negotiating table. So through a broader contextualization of these men and their respective papers, I've been able to understand better how to explore other collections, such as those at Harvard and Michigan, University of Wisconsin, the University of Pennsylvania, and also with my colleague Semi Chalik at the University of Exeter, the Ottoman Imperial Archives. It is through these multiple archival lenses that tonight I place the archaeological work conducted under the auspices of Princeton University in Greater Syria, Jerusalem, and at Sardis in a deeper context of US foreign policy at the end of empire. I examine this trajectory in 3 lines, which twist and turn, often blurring across time and space. These topics are broadly partage, especially the dynamic policies forged between the Imperial Museum in Constantinople and Princeton University, the institutionalization of archaeology through the lens of technical assistance, and the civilizing paradox, which became entangled in and benefited from the sovereign interests in territory. Okay. In 1899, Osman Hamdi Bey granted a permit for the American archaeological expedition to Syria to undertake archaeological fieldwork, and it was led by a then young Butler. Hamdi Bey is a well-known figure. He was an artist in his own right, and he served as the director of the Imperial Museum, dedicated to its expansion and to shoring up Ottoman laws and policies regarding antiquities. He came to know Charles Norton, the president of the AIA, through excavations at places such as Assos in western Anatolia. And he also came to know a man named Alison Armour, who was a business tycoon and explorer who ferried archaeologists about the Mediterranean aboard his yacht, and who was to become very close with the German Kaiser, and also keeper at the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, director of the British School at Athens, and well-known field archaeologist in his own right, David Hogarth. The 3 Ottoman firmans, or concessions, for Princeton surveys in Greater Syria reflect the good standing of these 3 Americans in the eyes of Hamdi Bey. The first, in 1899 to 1900, went to Norton. The second, in 1904 and 1905, to Butler, and the third, in 1909, to Armour. Yet Butler led all 3 expeditions, even if his name was only tied to one. The one that his name was tied to, the second survey, took place again between 1904 and 1905. And Hamdi Bey and Butler agreed, and the archives have contradictory evidence of precisely who proposed the idea to whom, that prior to setting off into the desert, the Princeton team would take up the Orpheus mosaic at the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem, which had been discovered several years prior. This came at a time when mosaics were part of the currency of cultural sovereignty, and for the Ottoman regime, attempts to reaffirm its territorial integrity. In late September of 1904, the Princeton team extracted it and prepared it for shipping to the Imperial Museum. Platitudes for Butler flowed in the diplomatic correspondence on both sides. In his publications, however, he he was much more reserved, even though his efforts had resulted in provisions for partage. Princeton's President Woodrow Wilson, as well as others, believed that in mobilizing Antiquity, Butler's efficacy in strategic diplomacy would bolster an American-Ottoman alliance. While conducting fieldwork in Syria, Butler leveraged not only his gift for languages — he spoke English, French, Greek, Arabic, and a bit of Turkish — but also his cosmopolitanism and his humility. He bristled when the Kaiser brazenly carried off carpets and other fine things from his house, and yet he embraced encounters in Syria with his British colleagues, such as Mark Sykes and David Hogarth and Gertrude Bell. In fact, one night in the desert, in late February of 1905, Bell copied the American maps, and I'll return to this point later. A year later, in 1906, Butler's relationship with Hamdi Bey strengthened when he oversaw the installation of the mosaic in the Imperial Museum. At home, Butler's colleagues pronounced this to be Princeton's gift to Turkey. Butler's integrity and high professional standards led Hamdi Bey to invite him to excavate Sardis. For decades, Hamdi Bey had contended with the legacies of elites vying for this site. He'd sent Ottoman archaeologists to assess the situation, hoping to have the Imperial Museum do the work. But they, too, returned dismayed. To tackle Sardis, they needed an institution or someone, not only with money, but also with the capacity to oversee the removal of meters and meters of overburden from centuries of earth washing down and covering the ruins. In the Sardis Society, and a tie to Princeton, and more specifically to Butler, Hamdi Bey found a fit, and even agreed to partage, which at the time was quite an accomplishment. With financing from the likes of J.P. Morgan, Cyrus McCormick, William Hepburn Buckler, Robert Garrett, Alison Armour, and the experience of Princeton engineers, faculty and students expert in railroads, cartography, and construction, including Charles Reed, Edward Stover, and William Barry, Butler went to work. The Syrian camp at Sardis came from Jerusalem. This included the Thomas Cook tents and the associated materials necessary to set up a work and residential space. A full kitchen, beds, desks, and equipment. So too came people to serve the expeditions, as Butler wrote, new household in Asia Minor, 3 camp servants known and tried in Syria, all Christian Arabs. The dragoman also came. So all of these folks packed up everything in Jerusalem, went out through Haifa, then through the Mediterranean, came in through the port of Smyrna, and came up the railroad to Sardis. Here I've been able to tentatively identify those who came from Syria to serve the camp. And this well-known image of Butler inside one of the white tents, the interiors, as you can see, were very decorative, were mainstays in letters home. In addition, David Hogarth loaned his foreman from Cyprus. Within weeks, then, Butler went about building a more permanent facility. While I had come to know this structure through my reading of the archives, Butler's publications, as well as the work of Zeynep Çelik as Villa Omphili, after the goddess of Lydia, and more colloquially as the American Palace. Here I offer how the incoming president of Princeton, John Hibben, described it in 1912. The Princeton Club of Sardis. Stepping back to consider the endeavor in its entirety, it does take on a more club-like feeling. The facility had residential rooms. There was a plumbing system, a telephone to the excavation units, a library, a museum, as well as a golf course, and ultimately a tennis court. Yes, this has been fun for me. Visitors, and these included Hogarth and the Kaiser and diplomats who Butler met in Syria and in Smyrna, as well as donors and their wives, all poured in. They came and they camped, sometimes for several months, at the nearby Halt Sulphur Springs behind the Acropolis. And during the day, they would ride horses to come and scratch tombs, as they put it, and marvel at the system of track and dump cars and the trestles. A workforce of hundreds cleared 1 cubic yard of earth every 10 minutes. Butler celebrated the Temple of Artemis emerging from a great pit. The man who'd agreed to the project, Hamdi Bey, never saw it. He died on the 24th of February, 1910, mere weeks after Butler had arrived at Sardis for the first season and in the snow. After that first year, a man named Aziz Ogan became the government representative. The club didn't suit him and his young family well enough, so at his request, the expedition built, as they put it, a new Sardis mansion called the Konak in the nearby town of Salakli. In addition to the temple, there was Tomb Hill, as they called it, overseen by William Hepburn Buckler, major patron of the project, who I've introduced a bit, but he was also, in the archives you learn, the formal associate director, and he and Robert Garrett held the export permission. In his raw, uncensored private correspondences to his wife, so we have to give him a little bit of leeway here, he described his workforce as hundreds of ants who ransacked the tombs, and over the course of 4 years, this would be 1,154 burials that they opened. The undertaking in its full scale put in place the infrastructure for years of planned fieldwork and training. It complemented Butler's plans for a school of architecture and a new museum at Princeton, funded by the McCormick family, who would have a partnership also with the civil and electrical engineering experts from the School of Science at Princeton, those who were trained in railroads, cartography, grid lines, electricity, and telephone. In February of 1912, President Hibben gave tribute to the Princeton Club of Sardis as a strategic part of the university's global mission. He rhetorically asked, "Where is Princeton?" To which he answered, "Princeton is wherever the Princeton spirit is incarnate in the hearts of Princeton men," to which the room erupted in great applause. In the mixing of the 20th century research with their classical pursuits, the Americans at Sardis came with their mixed mindsets. Against the fantasy backdrop of the picturesque sublime, letters describe the region and its people as uncivilized, wanton, wild, and untamed. In performing the uplifting mission of the Princeton spirit, this group considered themselves as masters of a future Western cultural geopolitical imagination. They believed that they had shown their apt ability to penetrate and conquer geological processes to access temples and tombs. And yet, at the same time, they relished in the picturesque, as demonstrated in this near-divine response to a trek after snowfall. The scenery on our walk was perfectly magnificent, for every tree and twig and mountain stood out against the blue sky, against the distant stretch of Bin Tepe, was like a great iced cake on which the Lydian tumuli were raised decorations, and the scene was almost painfully dazzling. I don't have a picture of Bin Tepe in the snow, which is hard to get, so you can imagine it here. Just 4 days prior, this same group had gone to Bin Tepe for a shooting expedition. The take here had been 1 red-legged partridge, 2 smaller birds, possibly larks, and 1 wood pigeon. They missed 3 partridges clean, but then had success and luckily shot the 4th one as dead as a stone. So as they shed their collars of civilization, as they called it, they found no contradiction in doing so as they viewed Halley's Comet through a telescope and went on their shooting expeditions. They went about collecting scorpions and spiders too, sending these alive in small boxes to colleagues in the US and England. So held up in their villa or their luxury tents, this group embraced self-alienating strategies that justified, for them, a distancing from local communities, and yet their good breeding, as they put it, meant that they dutifully went about being neighbors worth having, as they wrote. Butler presented shotguns to village headmen and extended invitations to lavish events. So one of these events took place on the 8th of March, 1912, a Friday night, and the expedition here celebrated Butler's 40th birthday at the villa. Buckler wrote in detail of the event to his wife, Georgina. And here I quote, it's a lengthy quote. "The courtyard was illuminated with balls of Greek fire, ashes soaked in petroleum, where Butler stood in the center, supported by a soldier on each side. The soldiers fired their rifles in the air, so that for some time one might have supposed a battle was in progress. All the natives, many of whom had of course come up from the village, went one by one into the small ring of light and gave a brief specimen of their dancing. The feature, however, was the sword dance by Bashara and his helper, with bayonets borrowed from the soldiers, which was really worthy of the Colosseum. They glared and lunged and swooped around each other in a way that was thrilling. The whole performance lasted only from 8 to 9. At the end, we all found ourselves much exhausted, though we had done nothing but stand and look on. We agreed that this exhaustion must be due to the pulsing of the drums and understood why such noises were used in the religious ceremonies like those of Kibale." Butler's conceptual thinking about the value of fieldwork as a humanistic training slowly became enmeshed not only with the science of doing archaeology, which he did do and which I am not talking about this evening, but also the politics of US foreign policy. As German, British, French, Italian, Dutch, and Greek interests from archaeology to agriculture ruffled Ottoman feathers, Americans presented themselves as neutral, beneficial partners. That same year, in 1912, wartime displacement in the Balkans sent in an influx of refugees. In the archival images on the Princeton website, as well as a lot more that are coming out, we begin to understand more clearly the multi-ethnic makeup of who's who in the photographs. This influx of people requiring employment presented opportunity for Sardis, able and willing to hire in the hundreds, much to the relief of local authorities. The expedition also supplied free medical treatments, set broken limbs, and when necessary, arranged for transfer to and treatment in the Smyrna hospitals, not only for the refugees, but also for local communities. Over time, expedition members and leadership came to know implicitly the ebb and flow of this territory extremely well. They knew where the trains lugged along. They knew who kept healthy horses for hire. They knew the seasonal agricultural cycles, the trade routes. Their riding excursions gave them firsthand knowledge of wetlands, soil conditions, and the best points for fording the Gadiz, the ancient Hermus, or where to take the pole ferry. Days spent shooting meant that they came to know the patterns of bird migrations and the dense thickets with hare and wild boar and deer. And they knew the locations of villages and who was who among them. In Smyrna, they knew those at the Imperial Bank and the patterns of quarantine and the locations of lighthouses. They debated the finer points of Buckler's ship reading, the 1910 Great Illusion. What of the futility of war, the inherent desire for peace, they asked. Was diplomacy the best ammunition, they hoped. They also kept up with elite circles. In late April of 1914, Alison Armour summoned Butler to Smyrna, and off they went to meet up with the Kaiser and King Constantine of Greece. Supposedly Butler only went kicking, as he wrote, upon Buckler's insistence that to miss this, quote, unique opportunity to visit the empire would be a great mistake, and that the reflected glory of this visit would almost certainly help the appeals for funds. 2 months later, with Sardis now established, Butler closed up for the season, planning to return in 1915. The age of empires, in contrast, was crumbling, and as the nationalistic sentiments took root, people ramped up their efforts to secure advantageous alliances, hyped up discourses of civilizing missions and benchmarks of progress, brought new intensity to American participation in the great game to sway hearts and minds, and for Americans to begin to edge their way into this territory. On the 9th of December 1916, the Daily Princetonian ran a front-page essay by Butler, "Art Makes the World a Finer Place to Live In." He wrote that appreciation and, importantly, patronization of the arts played a crucial role in building one's social, spiritual, and mental development. Here Here and in his letters, he called on the Princetonian community, the bankers, the engineers, the business tycoons, the diplomats, the politicians, and the archaeologists, to find common ground in the intellectual project that included Americans working abroad, and in retrospect, laid the foundations for shaping his work with the inquiry. The inquiry was led by a forthright, outspoken Texan who had the ear of President Wilson. This was Edward House. The inquiry was a group committed to sharing expertise with the goal of furthering American interests for the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. Today, I believe it would be classed as soft, strategic, open intelligence. Regarding Ottoman lands, the Society for the Promotion of Hellenic Studies wrote of the unique opportunity for safeguarding her monuments of art and history, laying claim to expertise as Western, and thus to be the charge of Western scholars in Paris. Unsurprisingly, those who'd participated in archaeological expeditions, such as Butler, were tapped to provide summaries and reports. These spheres of knowledge complemented technical numbers from the War Data Investigations Bureau. William Westermann, classics professor from the University of Wisconsin, oversaw the inquiry's Western Asia division. The inquiry began their meetings at the New York Public Library, but soon thereafter moved to the offices of the American Geological Society. Fitting, given that the institutional home of the AGS was the University of Wisconsin, where Westermann was based. More connections now begin to fall into place, and our cast of characters is familiar, and you'll see our very small network. You'll see these names start to come up again and again. On the 7th of November 1918, Alison Armour donated his 433 British Admiralty charts to the Society. While these maps give immense details of coastlines, the interior zones of Anatolia and Greater Syria required more precision. Recall that in 1905, on that March evening in the desert, when Gertrude Bell copied the American maps. A decade later, on the 18th of March, 1915, she wrote to her father, Sir Hugh Bell, to send on the maps for military planning. By this point, David Hogarth had taken up service with the British Naval Intelligence Division as acting director of the Arab Bureau. He too wrote to Butler for copies of the maps, which Butler dutifully sent. It wasn't until Butler's summer of 1922 essay, Maps Made in Syria by the Princeton Men Used in the British Campaign Against the Turks, published in the newsletter of Princeton Engineering Association, that the greater Princeton community learned of the details. And here I quote, "Early on in the war, a letter came to me from a professor in Oxford who was well acquainted with our work in Syria, asking if I were too neutral in thought to supply the British War Office with notes and tracings of the maps, which had not been published. My reply brought a formal request from the War Office for the use of this material." And again, note how careful he is to not say whether he said yes or no. On the 8th of May, 1916, the lines in the sand for the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement were set, and we can now add this small group of Americans and their maps to those who'd contributed to setting these boundaries. American archaeologists had become strategic players in the future military aspirations for the Middle East. Buckler went to Paris, writing extensively with Butler about plans for archaeology, so not just about the boundaries, but specifically with regard to archaeology. For the inquiry, Butler and Buckler collaborated with the AIA to draft the national laws and international policies for antiquity, which they hoped to see through. The public presentation was given in the 1919 publication for the Art Bulletin by Butler, Protection for the Historic Monuments and Objects of Art in Near Asia. The longer draft document for the inquiry, Suggestions for the Internationalization of the Historic Monuments of Near Asia, is far more raw and direct. Communities who had been, quote, ruled by aliens against their will were to be freed from the present bondage and afforded liberty to work out their own national destiny. This evidence of the Allies liberating communities from an imperial yoke was then marshaled to justify another. These people who now occupy these lands, however worthy of protection, however deserving of our sympathy and active aid, have not the knowledge to recognize the importance and value of historic monuments which lie all about them. For centuries, they have wantonly destroyed them. Butler lamented that the Turkish government had become ignorant and clumsy. He proposed a solution. He wrote, the time has come, at least, when the Western world, by which I mean the Entente powers and the American, by virtue of their position as victors in the Near East, could step in and save what is left of its rightful inheritance and protect it for the benefit of the future generations throughout the civilized world. The French, the British, and the Americans had observed the laws, he claimed, yet according to Butler, the Austrians and the Germans had not, and thus were to be given the least influence, as he put it. This bombastic rhetoric must be seen through the jealousy and anger of the Allies towards the tightening of a German-Turkish alliance. Butler claimed that the chief method used by the German archaeologist was to label cases for the museum in Constantinople, place them on the German ship bound for that port, and went on board to transfer to other cases prepared beforehand and labeled for Berlin, or simply to change the labels. Further proof of this behavior he offered was the conspicuous absence of objects from German excavations in Asia Minor in the Imperial Ottoman Museum, and the fact that a large museum is in the process of erection in Berlin. In contrast, material from Delos and Didyma and Ephesus and Sardis graced the quarters of the Imperial Museum. Butler then clarified, "This is what I mean when I say that equal privileges have not been extended to investigators of all nations and the legitimate interests of American museums." Butler's partage agreement had been nullified, and he attributed the timing to when German influence at the museum became supreme. Yet it wasn't just that he'd lost access to the movable property, the materials from the excavations. Remember, Buckler was the one who was interested in those more. The immovable investments, too, were in jeopardy. To address this issue, he drafted a plea for the protection of American educational and scientific enterprises in the Ottoman Empire, to address, as he wrote, the educational and scientific work carried out under the American auspices in the Turkish Empire, and to have the inquiry members represent these interests in the upcoming Paris negotiations. As he watched the results of decades of steadfast diplomacy begin to crumble behind closed doors and in personal correspondence, he was even more pointed. Scientists themselves are chiefly to blame, owing to their failure to act conjointly in making representations to the government and to convince Washington that they present a considerable number of citizens. Our representatives have never felt that they could make the same demands upon the Sublime Porte that other diplomats are continually making for the reasons that they have known those demands would not be backed up by Washington. He wrote that it had been the humiliating lot of more than one scientific investigator, when denied privileges stipulated in his permit, to see the U.S. consul collapse in the presence of a Turkish governor and to be forced to resort to a British consul, who would be found not only willing to give his services in the cause of scientific interests as international interests, but effective in securing the rights of the investigator. Butler began to question himself. He wrote, "Had he been very stupid to observe the Turkish laws governing excavations?" In Paris, allies were now busy planning for the future of Anatolia. Princeton classics professor, who'd also toured in Syria with Butler, David Magie, submitted population estimates for villages and towns and cities throughout Asia Minor. There was a possibility of the U.S. taking a mandate for Turkey, and Buckler would go on to draft this. Americans pitched that they were the least likely to foment political intrigue because they weren't out to claim, as they put it, imperialist land lost. As Americans had become more and more skilled in backdoor diplomacy, they attempted to leverage past ties and edge in their voice. But by late March of 1919, the French and the British tacitly supported Greek claims for the vast areas of Western Anatolia, now asking not if, but where the line would be set. In Paris, deliberations on these points could be heard in the corridors among delegates, as well as among the elites who attended the conference and their social circles over tea, lunch, cocktails, and dinner. When the Greek occupation of Smyrna took place on the 15th of May, 1919, American Fred Green of McAndrews and Forbes, a U.S. company involved in the production of licorice in Smyrna, reported unprecedented horrors from the port to Buja. Green wrote of the short-sightedness that proved that those at the head of the Greek military were totally incompetent or else so barbarous that they had sent the same troops with a hidden purpose. He warned that if Smyrna remains Greek, it means the certain doom of the city. It could not be otherwise, as the environs of Smyrna are not the producing ones, the shipping of Smyrna all being dependent upon the Meander and the Hermus valleys, he said. Princeton alumni William Rancid Berry with the U.S. War Department, based in Smyrna, confirmed, and someone who'd worked at Sardis from 1910 to 1914, that the Greek landing division had been a bad lot, as he wrote, with very little or no tact and discretion. There was disgust at the unnecessary brutality. The same Greek division had turned machine guns on unarmed British and French troops in the streets of Athens some months ago, he claimed. As the horrors in Smyrna unfolded, Berry cautioned that the situation in the interior would likely be much more tense than in Smyrna and would be a great deal harder to control. He spoke, of course, from knowledge of his days at Sardis, citing the layout of the villa, the golf course, and the tennis courts, hunting in the region, and getting to know the people that he hired to do work. A day after the landing on the 16th of May, 1919, Butler confided in his diary, "Miss Bell regards the outlook in Asia Minor as bad, unless the U.S. obtain and accept a mandate for Constantinople, Asia Minor, and Armenia. That is, for all the non-Arabic speaking parts of the Turkish Empire. She feels that any division of territory among several Western powers will not only lead to friction, but will cripple the development of the country itself. She regards excavation as impossible until the status of the country is fixed." A week later, on the 23rd of May, 1919, Hogarth and U.S. Consul General in Smyrna, Horton, encouraged a field season at Sardis in attempt, as they put it, to stabilize territory. Here then, archaeology and American archaeologists took on many different roles. They were advisors to Allied militaries regarding the boundaries, and assets on the ground with networks capable, at least many felt, of operating in zones of occupation. Maps among the David Magie papers at Princeton show the full scope of Greek territorial hope from just east of Bandurma, the present-day Balıkesir-Bursa boundary, to Patara, the present-day Muğla-Antalya boundary, roughly. Both Magie and Westermann questioned the wisdom of carving up territory. On the 18th of June, 1919, Westermann wrote to U.S. Secretary of State Robert Lansing and Colonel House, among others, that the sovereignty of Turkey remain unimpaired, and if the American delegation was to endorse, even tacitly, its dismemberment, then Magie and Westermann would submit their resignations from deliberation. On the 23rd of June, 1919, Mr. J.C. Crew of the U.S. Commission to Negotiate Peace in Paris released them both at their request. At the same time, Sardis became more engulfed in the conflict, and by July of 1919, forces had taken 2 guards and 2 forestry personnel listed by name in the correspondence and 7 villagers. On the 7th of September 1919, U.S. Secretary of State Lansing formally appointed Berry to oversee and check in on Sardis. Barry's work was especially necessary because the commissioner in Izmir and the former Sardis government representative, you'll remember Aziz, had been called away during World War I, first deployed to Gallipoli and then from there to Damascus, where he assisted with the head of the German army on matters with archaeology. He had then returned to Smyrna, but shortly after the Greek occupation, he was jailed for 2 months, and upon release, he left the region, understandably. Rather than heed advice from assurances from officials, and here they range from the US and Greek leadership in Athens as well as in Smyrna, Butler and Buckler coordinated directly with Barry, as well as the Sardis guards and former workers. Early on in July of 1918, and here I'm going back a year, the facilities in the site had been in good condition. Only bedding, maybe clothing had been taken, and books and papers had been scattered. Their Swiss colleagues had gathered and taken to Smyrna the most important documents, small antiquities and instruments, and they also secured the house and the villa and arranged for a new Turkish military guard, a former and trustworthy gendarme named Ibrahim Çavuş. At the height of the occupation in May of 1919, villagers had fled into the hills, and during this period, supposedly a lawless group of bandits led by a man named Atembe, ransacked the residence before joining the Greek military. Along the Milne Line, named for the British general, ancient landmarks became militarized. A wire fence ran up the Acropolis, Sardis in the Greek territorial area, and Salikli, where Aziz's konak had been, was in Turkish. As the line went north, Bin Tepe was in the Turkish territory. Trenches were embossed on the slopes of the tumuli, and some of the interior chambers served as the barracks. And today, I saw some other images of these troops in Bin Tepe as well as at Sardis. Before running along the western shores of the Gygean Lake, it cut through Kamboğazı, which in Turkish means bloody throat pass. Villagers in the area were under nearly constant siege from the military raids on both sides, and even more so by the rogue groups of bandits. In the autumn of 1919, the villa had been ransacked for wood and fuel, and this time by Turkish forces. Windows and door frames, wainscoting, stairways, winged roofs, the floors, the bookcases, and all the furniture had been taken. The safe had been blown through and the kitchen stove plundered for pieces, but the antiquities were more or less intact. At least that was the writing from people checking in. And provisions were made to transport particularly the inscriptions away from the site. Barry's report from March of 1921 gives more details about the looting, and these are extreme. The missing 4 fingers of sculptures, the conditions of the engine house and the museum and the main house, even the tennis net. He listed the missing equipment, and here I'll give a list for you. 1 locomotive, 6 tins of fuel oil, 5 tins of petroleum, 5 oiling cans, 1 tin varnish, 2 lifting jacks, 4 sections of track, 20 dump cars, 50 shovels, 50 picks, 13 sections of iron water pipe, 3 telephones, 8 rolls of telephone wire, 1 roll of wire rope, 1 roll of white telephone rubber, 1 marble female head, 6 marble blocks. The nearby Uruk village had been ransacked, and people here had fled into the hills as well. Under the personalities, Barry listed the names and conditions of 22 people who knew the Sardis team, and Barry clearly knew them and felt the Sardis team members would want to be informed about their lives and those of their families. By spring of 1922, Butler returned to the field with a skeleton team. As James Good has written concerning the Sardis affair, as have I've written on this, and Fikret Yagul, in late June of 1922, Butler agreed to have finds shipped from Smyrna to New York. What led Butler, always an advocate for diplomacy with the Imperial Museum, to shift positions? We will never know how he would have received nor handled the long-term parameters of this material and the relationship with the Republic of Turkey. He died from complications with malaria on the 13th of August, 1922 in Paris. Malaria he'd apparently gotten when he'd visited the shores of the Aegean Lake. Some might believe that he felt wronged and deceived by Ottoman authorities regarding partage promises, and that he was especially angered by German access. From his letters intended for Butler, we do know that Buckler rejoiced in the material that had slipped through the eyes of the authorities. Yet had Butler lived, we might have seen a very different scenario play out. With authorities in country, Butler was committed to the Imperial Museum in being part of establishing this institution in its own right and in the infrastructure that had been realized at Sardis, a place he had intended to return to year after year to train young scholars. And I'd argue that it was the latter that meant the most to him, and where he'd become increasingly disappointed. Since May of 1919, Sardis had been not adequately protected and remained vulnerable in August of 1922. And in fact, we might put this date really in the summer of August 1914. Despite all efforts of the Sardis Society, local communities and their guards, and those in Constantinople. In essence, what they'd learned is that during times of conflict, their sites and their commitments and the communities around the sites became victims. What World War I and the disillusionment of empire had convinced Butler and his colleagues was that one needed an international body, or at least they hoped that an international body would have been able to help. In conclusion then, in the arc of engagement for Princeton in the Levant and Anatolia through 1922, it reflects a period of political transformation. Not only did the Ottoman imperial scope collapse, but so too did the might of others. During the period from the late 1890s through 1922, American archaeologists found themselves negotiating in the crosshairs of conflict. Entangled in the declining power of the Ottoman regime in the Levant, they dabbled strategically in Syria and Jerusalem, extending their technical expertise in removal and shipment and installation of one mosaic. This one act of imperial partage curried tremendous favor, and subsequent expeditions to Syria went extremely well, so well that Butler was targeted for the concession at Sardis. Together with the vision of creating a contemporary site for training architectural historians and those vested in archaeology and the history of art, Butler uplifted what it meant to do fieldwork. With the influence extending straight to the White House with Wilson's election in 1912, Butler had remarkable connections. Pivoting their hope on a vision for a world that would not descend into war, the Princeton group went about their mission. Yet war did come, and favor shifted in Constantinople, rattling decades-old provisions woven into the American concessions. Butler's ties with his British colleagues, who he'd come to know in the Syrian desert, drew him into the territorial aspirations of the Middle East. Carving up Anatolian territory to align with the Allies, however, was not of interest to Butler, nor to others such as Westermann and Magie. Here we see the influence of the Princeton-driven inquiry leverage their knowledge of the city-countryside linkages. Smyrna, they argued, could not function without its hinterland. Arguably, it was the intensive period at Sardis that gave them this insight. On the one hand, there was the legacy of the commitment to the Imperial Museum, but also the promise of the potential American mandate for Turkey. With archaeologists and their funders, such as William Hepburn Buckler, at the negotiating table, they saw opportunity. Their intimate knowledge of the region gave them insight into how and why the slicing and dicing into this larger goal would not be effective. If he could argue for an international commission, then he could also secure not only the movable material under conditions of agreements for equitable partage, but also the immovable, the place itself. Alas, the turn of events pivoted, and the U.S. did not push for, nor in the end take a mandate. And with Butler's death, much faded into the shadows. In closing, I can report that as part of my ongoing work, that Aziz and Butler did try to carry on work at Sardis through the mid-1930s, But in the end, the endeavor proved too daunting, and the monuments and earthworks of late Ottoman Sardis fell into ruin. And here, I'll just leave you with this one image from interwar Sardis, where you can see the villa up in the back there still standing. So it was not completely destroyed during the war, and exactly when it fell is the next topic. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this rich, fascinating talk. We know about what happened with the Antiquities in Sardis after 1922, but we didn't know so much about the whole history of the excavation, and you also painting a full portrait for Butler. Any questions from the audience here? I'm going to go check if there are also questions from the online audience. But do we have any questions here? No curiosity. Δεν ακούμε καθόλου. Okay, I'm gonna go over there.
Okay,
But
I'll stay here.
we have any, just to check if we have any questions.
Okay, I would like to ask a brief question. Just how long did Princeton, this was the end of Princeton's involvement with Sardis up until 1936, is that correct? And then, when did Harvard take over, I guess? Is what I'm
Harvard, so I haven't mentioned Harvard. That's more of a Cold War beginning. 1958 is when George Hoffman took over, and they built a whole new excavation house and changed their excavation foci significantly throughout the 1960s and 1980s, and then it's ongoing today. But Princeton didn't go back in the same way that they had prior. They were there for 4 years, 1910 to 1914.
I was curious about what happened to all the finds from Sardis in this period. Did they all wind up in the museum that you mentioned, or did some of them go to Princeton? I just wasn't clear on where they wound up.
So there's multiple people who've written on this, and James Good, particularly the Sardis affair. In the summer of 1922, through the Standard and Oil docks, which I didn't talk about, the material was spirited out, and much of it went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which Butler agreed to, and Buckler knew it was happening. When it got there, and the Republic of Turkey learned about it, they were quite upset, understandably, and they threatened to cut off diplomatic relationships between the two countries until the material was returned. A lot of the material was returned, except for the Sardis column, which if you go to the Met today, you can see. But much of the material from the tombs, and particularly the gold objects, as part of the partage agreement, the way I understand that Butler worked with Hamdi Bey and then later his predecessors, was that there was an active sending of material up to Constantinople. And particularly material that they didn't feel they could adequately protect at the small museum on site. And so that included a lot of the gold material. And I've wondered for years where that material is, and I encourage you all to go to Istanbul to see the new museum exhibition that just opened, because that material is finally on display. So, yes.
If you can go back to that slide that shows the census, and you have Sotiriadis there, the Greeks, the Turks. You had the results of before.
You tell me when I get to where you want to be.
No, before. Yeah. Isn't it says Soteriades over there? I think it's based on the, isn't it? It says.
I've never, the census ones. So the census from reading David Magie's archives at Princeton this year, there are multiple different census categories.
The name there, Soteriades, is the map. Let me get back to. No, it's Soteriou, or Soteriades, the map. We have a map on the exhibition, and I think it's a Soteriades map. On the exhibition, when you go in the historical part, we have a map that shows, was composed in 1919 and shows all the different minorities. And I think that's where it is based. You can, like next time, you can have them as well, the map on the screen when you show this, because we have the map here.
That would be
and on display that, So, do we have any other questions? Well, then we can thank our speaker, and we can. And there is a little reception downstairs, so if you have any questions for Christina, I'm sure she will be happy to answer them.